Well, hey, Mount Calvary Christian School and church students, it's good to be back with you. Our passage today is 1 Corinthians 11, 1 to 10. So if you want to pause it and take a look at those verses, that'd be great. We'll get started in a second. All right, so uh, there's kind of two big concepts that are here in this passage, and one is just this first verse, which I love. The very first verse that's here, where Paul says, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." And so I just wanted you to think about two questions when you think about this. First question that I want you to think about is, who are you following? Certainly, I think the churchy answer would be to say that we follow Christ, right? But Paul says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And so there's an element that Paul's saying, follow me, and I am going to continue to follow Christ. So my question is, who on earth do you look up to in the way that Paul talks about here? Who builds into you and brings you along as they are pursuing Christ? I encourage you, that if you don't have that kind of mentor relationship that Paul describes there, to consider who you could ask to invest in you in that way. And the second part of that is, who are you able to say what Paul just said to? Like, who is following after you? And just as I think that it's important that somebody mentors into you, I think it's important that you find ways and people that you can mentor and bring alongside you as you follow Christ. And you might think, I'm too young, but Paul, in a different letter to Timothy, in 1 Timothy 4:12, he says, "Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity." And so I just encourage you that just because you might be young, there's certainly the ability that you have to say what Paul says: "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." So just consider again both parts of who is investing in you, and who can you be investing in. The next topic, which really goes from verses 2 through the end of our passage to verse 10, talks about this idea of headship, which is a challenging topic. And some people tend to think that this word head just means source, as in like that man comes from Christ and that woman comes from man, like literally that a woman was taken out of a man, as we know the story of Adam and Eve. And I don't think that's what this is getting at here. It's pretty clear that this passage is talking about the idea of authority and submitting to authority. And so that's what I want to kind of focus in on here as with this second kind of concept. The key verse here is verse 3, and that's the one I'm going to just kind of spend my time talking about, which says this: "But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God." There's three relationships that are here. The head of, and I'm going to go in a certain order. I want to start with the fact that it says the head of Christ is God, and then we'll go with the head of every man is Christ, and we'll finish with the head of a wife is her husband. So the first one, the head of Christ is God. This means that Christ submits to God's authority. And a quick example of two examples of where we can see that this is true is Philippians 2, 5 to 8 says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who," and this is now all about what Christ has done, "that he was in the form of God, but he did not count equality with God as a thing to be grasped, but instead he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Again, Christ, whose head is God, has submitted to him, and he emptied himself, and he took the form of a servant. He died he was obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so it's not that Christ is inferior to God. They are co-eternal. Jesus has the same essence as the Father, but he still submitted to the Father, even to the point of death on the cross. And speaking of Jesus' death on the cross, you also think about what happened right before Jesus was arrested, tried, and crucified. He was praying in the garden, and you know what he was praying for. He said, "Father, if there's any other way, take this cup from me." But you know what the passage also says, right? It doesn't just stop there with Jesus saying, "Take this cup from me," but he also says, "But not my will, but yours be done." Again, this idea that he's submitting to the authority of the Father. And so just as the Father is the head of Christ, we move into the second relationship that's there, which is that Christ is the head of the man, or that the head of man is Christ. And again, I think there's a lot of similarities. There are similarities between man and Christ, just as there are similarities between Christ and God. So man and Christ are obviously both man. We would read in Romans 8 that man is fellow heirs with Christ. And so a man should submit to Christ, but obviously all the way back in Genesis 3, we've messed it up. And ever since Genesis 3, there's been a conflict between man and Christ. And this logic certainly applies to men and women, but I think it's important to think, like big picture idea here, that you think about how the head treated the person who was supposed to submit, right? So think about for a second. Christ, who man is supposed to submit to, how did Christ lead? Well, he led in a loving and and sacrificial way, to the point where he died for the one who should have been submitting to him. So you think about Christ's example for us of how to lead. And now, for me as a man, I want to submit my life to what Christ has done because of the great love that he has for me. So again, thinking of that, yes, there is this element of I submit to Christ, but there's also a beautiful element here of how Christ leads and sacrificially and lovingly leads those he should submit to. And then we get to the last one, which is a tricky one, which is that the head of the wife is the husband. And this is the one our culture has lots of problems with and struggles with a lot. But this does not mean that man's authority over woman does not equate to being to inferiority. Jesus was under the authority of God the Father, but we wouldn't say that Jesus was inferior. We would say that they were co-eternal, that they are equal, and yet there is a level that Jesus still submitted to the Father. And in the same way, this does not imply that a woman is less than a man. It does not, just because a man has authority in this way, does not mean it's less than. As a matter of fact, just like I did with Christ being the head of the man, I want to just point out this, that Christ being the head of the man is our example of what it should look like for the man to be the head, or for the husband to be the head of the wife, in that we should love and care and serve sacrificially to the woman, to the wife. Is there an element that a woman needs to that there's submission and authority to what a man has? Yes, but the picture that God creates here is not one of a man that's domineering and abusing his power, but instead it's a sacrificial leader who is looking out for the betterment of those around him. And just as I see Christ's love for me and willingly want to submit, a man should lead in such a way that it's easy for a woman to submit. Much of the passage after this goes on to talk about head coverings, which I think is just a symbolic way of talking about submission to authority. And so I'm convinced that the more important topic here is this idea of heart level submission. So again, it's a tricky passage, and I just want to leave you with this one thought. How can you better submit to Christ today? How can you appreciate the love and care that he has shown to you, and in turn want to follow him more closely? Again, hope you're doing well. I miss you guys. Think of you often, and pray that you are doing well.